Welcome to Let's Get to Work, Reimagining Disability Inclusive Employment Policy, brought to you by the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. And now, here's your host, Michael Morris.
Welcome. My name is Michael Morris, and I am the moderator of this podcast series, Let's Get to Work. We are going to bring guests to you with unique knowledge and insights about their perspective in the employment space, in public policies that advance employment or may hold progress back for people with disabilities. Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University, in collaboration with researchers at Rutgers and Harvard Universities, established in September 2020 a new center to study disability inclusive employment policy. Our first guest today is Doug Kruse, professor at Rutgers University. Doug has had a very distinguished career, not only in academia, but also worked in the Obama White House, and we'll learn more about his background and experience. Doug, it's great to have you here. And maybe to start off, can you tell us a little bit about your educational training as an economist and what have been the primary motivating factors for you to dedicate your research to improving understanding and knowledge of public policy to advance employment and economic self-sufficiency for people with disabilities?
I'm very pleased to be on this podcast. This is certainly an set of issues that's very important to me, and I'm really glad to be part of this. You ask about my training as an economist. From an economic perspective, disability raises a lot of basic issues in labor supply and demand. You know, on the supply side, what kinds of factors limit the ability and willingness to work among people with disabilities? You know, the time and energy costs there may be, the transportation issues, medical schedules, disability income. But on the demand side, it's also very interesting to look at what kinds of factors limit the willingness of employers to hire people with disabilities. There may be concerns about productivity, accommodation costs, discomfort and prejudice. And I actually think a big factor there is simple uncertainty. Maybe not a simple case of prejudice, but uncertainty among employers about how productive people with disabilities will be and how they'll get along with coworkers. That uncertainty can be a form of prejudice in itself, I think. But I do think that's an important factor. In some of the studies we've done, we found that employers are less likely to express interest in job applicants with disabilities. And I think that's one of the key factors. I should say they're less likely to express interest even when the qualifications are identical to that of people without disabilities.
Thank you for those insights. I know in reading your bio and background, you had the unique privilege to serve on the White House Council of Economic Advisors to former President Barack Obama. You probably, I'm guessing, were probably may have been the first person with a disability ever to serve on the White House Council of Economic Advisors. What was that like, and how did your personal and professional insights perhaps influence some of their thinking?
Just a small correction. I wasn't on the council itself, but I was a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors. And that was a very exciting time. It was very educational for me, and I hope I did play some role in helping improve public policy. I dealt with a number of disability issues. For example, that's the time that the minimum wage is being raised for federal contractors. President Obama signed an executive order to increase the minimum wage to $10.10 for federal contractors. And a big question there was whether that would apply to all people with disabilities. That is, whether sub-minimum wage would be disallowed for people with disabilities. And the final decision, I did a fair amount of research on that, and the final decision was that this would apply to all workers. There would be no sub-minimum wage. So that's just one example of one of the topics that I found really interesting and where I hopefully made a small contribution to good public policy.
As I mentioned, you are part of a team working with other researchers from Rutgers, Harvard, and Syracuse University in a relatively new center to study disability inclusive employment policy. That's kind of a mouthful, disability inclusive employment policy. What does that mean to you, and why should it be important to employers, people with disabilities, and the economy?
Most basically, the disability inclusive employment policy means having policies that help ensure that everyone has good opportunities for employment. And when I say, employment, I'm not talking about just any job, but good jobs, not only in terms of income, but also skill development, good relations with coworkers, being part of mainstream society. And that's especially important for people with disabilities who are, we know from other research, are more socially isolated. Employment can be really important for helping them be part of the mainstream society. So it's very important for people with disabilities. For employers, disability inclusive policy means making the use of all the available abilities out there in the economy, especially in times of labor shortages like now, when employers have to reach out to tap overlooked pools of human resources. For the economy, you asked about the economy in general, there is economic value in ensuring all human resources are utilized. That improves the overall economy. But there's also a more fundamental value in inclusion of everyone in our growingly diverse workforce, making sure everyone works well together and benefits from diversity. There are a number of studies that have been done on showing that diversity can enhance creative work and innovations. That may be especially true for people with disabilities. One of my favorite quotes actually is from a Pillsbury executive who said, "Our environment is creative and innovative. People with disabilities by default are very creative and knowledgeable about a variety of issues because they have to be in their everyday lives." I think that's very true. People with disabilities can be very creative. They have all kinds of issues to cope with. And that's good for workplaces and good for the economy as a whole if people with disabilities are using those creative skills.
Excellent. Let me turn to some of the areas you're now very focused in your studies. One of those areas is the changing nature of work, with particular attention to more flexibility by employers in allowing telework. Why is this an important question for individuals with disabilities? And what have you been learning? What have you learned so far in this era of COVID? Telework is one of the hottest issues, working from home versus everyone being in a central workplace. What are we learning?
Right. It's a very interesting issue. And I have to say I was interested in it even before the COVID pandemic, in particular because telework offers advantages to many people with disabilities, particularly people who have mobility issues, find it hard to commute, or who need extra flexibility to deal with medical or therapy schedules, something like that. And we did research before the pandemic, finding that workers with disabilities were more likely to do telework than were workers without disabilities. And that was continuing all the way up through 2019. But an interesting thing happened in the pandemic. As we all know, there is a rapid expansion of telework, and people with disabilities actually got left behind in that rapid expansion of telework during the pandemic because so many were in blue-collar and service jobs that can't be done at home. The people with disabilities are disproportionately likely to be in those kinds of jobs. So when we saw that huge increase, that huge expansion, people with disabilities were left behind. And we've been able to track that out using federal data over the past couple of years. It's really hard to say going forward what this means. The pandemic we've argued that it may have a silver lining for people with disabilities. It's obviously been devastating to all workers, but there may be a silver lining if it makes employers more open to telework and to flexible arrangements. And more fundamentally, employers have had to rethink how a lot of jobs are done. And that rethinking, the restructuring of jobs, may be a very good thing for people with disabilities. It may open up employers to additional kinds of accommodations that can be done. So the pandemic may have a silver lining for people with disabilities. One hopeful sign, actually, is that employment rates for people with disabilities in the last 3 months, and just generating these numbers, up through January 2022, the employment rates are actually higher than just before the pandemic, unlike for people without disabilities. So people with disabilities have been doing especially well in the past few months. And an interesting part of that is that the increase was highest in teleworkable occupations. That's the term that our colleague in the center, Nicole Meistis at Harvard, has used. Teleworkable, the occupations that can most easily be done at home. The increase was highest for people with disabilities in employment in those teleworkable occupations. We're going to be focusing on this more closely in the next few months, doing as part of the Disability Inclusive Employment Policy Center, using 3 government surveys.
Excellent. We'll look forward to learning more about it. Some very interesting observations. I know another of your studies is focused on state-level changes to minimum wages to be paid workers. I know you're in the middle of that study, but what are you learning about the impact of these changes on labor force participation by people with disabilities?
We haven't really started this study yet. Minimum wage has been highly controversial ever since it was started in the 1939 Fair Labor Standards Act. And it's been mostly controversial about the possible negative employment effects on raising the cost of labor. There's been literally hundreds of studies that economists have done without a clear consensus. A lot of recent studies focus on variation among states, since each state can set the minimum wage higher than federal level. The federal level, I live in New Jersey, and the New Jersey minimum wage is now $13 as of January 1st. Well, the federal minimum wage is $7.25. So states vary in their minimum wages, and we plan to exploit state variation, looking before and after minimum wage is raised in the state, with comparisons to similar states where the minimum wage is not raised, to see how employment of people with disabilities may have changed. As I said, we haven't really got this study started yet. I can't really predict what we're going to find. There's no consensus on minimum wage effects in general, but the studies that do find a negative effect tend to be based on lower paid workers. And we know from many sources that people with disabilities tend to be lower paid in general. So it's possible we'll find a negative effect. As part of this study in the minimum wage, we're going to be also studying the sub-minimum wage. The Fair Labor Standards Act, as I'm sure many listeners know, allows some people with disabilities to be paid less than the minimum wage under certain conditions. Generally, that's in sheltered workshops, and that's very controversial right now. There's a lot of controversy about whether that should be continued. President Biden actually has said that he wants to eliminate that. A number of states already have eliminated that. They've transitioned out of sub-minimum wage sheltered workshop arrangements, and it doesn't appear that there have been any negative effects of these transitions on employment of people with disabilities. But we're going to be doing the first comprehensive analysis across states, looking at how the transitions affect not just the employment, but also the income and the poverty levels among people with disabilities. It may help for people with disabilities to have competitive integrated employment is the term.
Excellent. We look forward to learning more from your studies in the future years. Another question, and one that's been debated regularly for many years, is the expectations were so high with the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and yet the historical low levels of employment for people with disabilities continues to prevail. What do you think are some of the major factors that continue to adversely impact employment of people with disabilities?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I guess one point to make first is that the ADA was never intended to be an employment program. So the major factors that continue to affect employment of people with disabilities, there is employer discrimination that continues to exist. The ADA was designed to get rid of discrimination, but we and others have found in field experiments that employers are still less likely to express interest in job applicants with disabilities, even when the resumes are identical to people without disabilities, and when the job is not, and when the job can be done by a person with a disability with the same level of productivity. So we've done some of these field experiments that show pretty clearly employers are still reluctant. Apart from that, people with disabilities continue to face a number of barriers, low education and training levels, which put them at a disadvantage. There's often extra costs of work, combined with lack of access to assistive technologies that can help out. Disability income programs are a big issue. There's employment disincentives that I'm sure many of the listeners are familiar with from a disability income programs. You can only earn up to a certain amount in Social Security disability insurance and supplemental security income programs. You can only earn up to a certain amount if you want to maintain your benefits. I just point to another big factor being, in general, the social isolation that people with disabilities have. I referred to this before. People with disabilities are more likely to live alone. They travel and socialize less. And the key thing here is that reduces their social networks and connections that lead to jobs. We've all heard the term, it's not what you know, it's who you know. Well, it is who you know, and who you know depends on your social networks, and people with disabilities tend not to have as extensive social networks as people without disabilities. So that's another barrier that continues to limit their employment. I should say as well, I want to add in here that a couple of studies did blame the ADA for hurting the employment of people with disabilities based on the requirement for accommodations. And those studies were certainly well done, but they took a really narrow view of what constitutes a disability. They used the existing measures, which were not very adequate, I believe. And there have been a number of studies since that time saying, no, maybe the ADA didn't greatly help employment of people with disabilities, but it certainly didn't hurt the employment of people with disabilities. And some recent studies of state disability anti-discrimination laws also found either no effects or even positive effects on the employment of people with disabilities. So that's a really interesting area in itself, the policy effects of anti-discrimination statutes.
I want to move us a little bit away from policy to the more general topic, a phrase we have heard so regularly for the past several years. People are talking a lot about, quote, the future of work, end quote. As an economist, what does that mean? How do you study it? And what might you expect it to be the future impact on people with disabilities?
That's a big topic and something that we talk a lot about in my school at Rutgers. We're the School of Management and Labor Relations, and we talk about the future of work and the future of workers. The discussions about the future of work generally focus on the role of technology. A long-running concern, going back actually a couple centuries, is technological unemployment, that as technologies get developed, they destroy jobs and put people out of work. Studies of this over the past century by economists have generally found that technology creates just as many or more jobs as it destroys. There may be dislocation, but it creates jobs in other areas. For example, the development of the car destroyed the buggy whip industry, but it created a lot of jobs for automobile workers. But there is a growing concern among many leading economists that new technologies in the next few decades may in fact destroy more jobs than they create. We may have, basically all of our physical needs met by technology, in which case the crucial issue is who owns the technology. My other big research program, apart from disability, is employee ownership and profit sharing in businesses. And my colleague Richard Freeman at Harvard has argued that workers need to own the robots that are taking their jobs, or we'll wind up with an increasingly bifurcated society where capital owners get almost all the income and a growing number of us struggle to make ends meet. Of course, even when technology makes a difference in jobs, that doesn't mean it will necessarily destroy jobs. David Otter at MIT has done some of the leading work here. He's written about how the shape of jobs and how job tasks will change in jobs that continue to exist. Basically the tasks that are more rote and repetitive will be done by machines increasingly, which means that the tasks that require more creativity and judgment will continue to be done by humans, which raises the importance of training people in broad thinking skills, especially people with disabilities, who currently have lower levels of education in general and may especially benefit from higher education that develops those critical thinking skills that allows them to take advantage of the benefits that technology may bring us.
Let's maybe go to another related topic, back to public policy. What public policies do you think need to be the focus of your research and others you're working with so that we can better encourage and support employment of individuals with disabilities?
The first thing to say here is that the barriers to employment are complex and interconnected. There's no silver bullet for improving employment of people with disabilities from a policy perspective. Really, the best thing, I think by far, is a strong labor market or a tight labor market where unemployment rates are low. That seems to have really helped employment of people with disabilities in the last half of the last decade. From 2014 to 2019, before the pandemic, employment of people with disabilities was going up faster than among people without disabilities. And that seems to be due to the strong labor market. In addition, in the past few months, I mentioned earlier that people with disabilities now have a higher employment rate than they did just before the pandemic. Well, a lot of that is almost certainly due to the strong labor market, the low unemployment levels, which means employers are getting desperate for workers, so they're more willing to tap that labor pool of people with disabilities and make accommodations and so forth. So the best policy, most important policy, is to keep a strong labor market with high employer demand. But the strong labor market, of course, is not sufficient if workers can't get to the jobs. There's a variety of policies that are important. Community-based services and supports, home care, transportation, job coaches. Our colleague Nicole Meistis, who I believe is going to be doing a podcast as well from Harvard, she's looking at this, among other factors, as a possible contributor to the good employment performance of people with disabilities in the 2014 to 2019 period. Also, I think it is important, given the low education levels of people with disabilities in general, to have policies increasing support for education and training of people with disabilities, including apprenticeships, plus training for entrepreneurs with disabilities to start and grow their own businesses. Another thing I'd just highlight is that the federal government, I think, should work more closely with federal contractors to help them increase their percentage of people with disabilities to the 7% goal for federal contractors. As you know, we have a sister center to the Disability Inclusive Employment Policy Center. We have the Employer Disability Practices Center based at Rutgers, but working closely with Syracuse, Harvard, Indiana, and the National Organization on Disability. And this center is focused on employer policies rather than public policies. We are working with some National Organization on Disability employers to explore policies and practices that will help create an inclusive climate, increasing the hiring of people with disabilities, but also encouraging existing employees to self-identify with a disability and be willing to ask for accommodations. So that's, there's employer policies obviously involved in that, but that's something that I think is a matter for public policy too, especially given that the federal government has established this 7% goal for federal contractors. And right now, I think there's only one company I know of in the country that's met that 7% goal. Most companies are really struggling to meet that.
So that maybe takes me to a related question, and that is, you've talked about got tremendous demand for workers, millions of jobs going unfilled right now. But at the same time, it does appear, mostly anecdotal, but there are, I think you'll be studying and others will be studying, that there does seem to be a shift in business culture and more positive receptiveness to increasing a diverse and inclusive workforce. What changes do you think can push further to support those types of positive attitudes? And as you said, with that 7% federal contractor goal, move more into that category. What is it going to take?
It's clear that we've got a more diverse workforce, and that's going to continue happening. And people with disabilities are clearly part of that diversity, especially given that disability is expected to increase in the next couple of decades. What that means is there will be not only more workers with disabilities, but also more consumers with disabilities. And I think that's one of the things driving this increased attention among businesses. There's a whole group of consumers out there who have to be appealed to with firms' products and services. In addition to those with a disability themselves, consumers in general tend to respond well to companies that employ people with disabilities. There's actually been some recent research done on this that I find really interesting, that consumers respond well. They think better of companies when they employ people with disabilities. And I think companies are becoming aware of this. So I think that's really helping drive a lot of this increased receptiveness and business culture that you talk about. That's what our centers are all about, is trying to look at kinds of policies that can create greater sense of inclusion, everything from paid leave and other benefits like that to disability training. Yeah, I think there's a whole variety. It's there's a lot happening that I think is very exciting.
You've been engaged in disability-focused research in the economic area, employment area, as well as some other areas. But is there sort of a flow or from your perspective, where might the next generation of research questions go that can help us add knowledge, help us improve public policy, as you've talked about at the state as well as the federal level, and really further advance a way for more people with disabilities to be employed, to be in better paying jobs, to be in careers, and be able to advance in those careers? Is there a way you sort of can frame out for our listeners how to, big question, where might the research go that will then drive thinking and behavior?
Obviously a big and important question, and that's something that, as you know, we're really grappling with in the two centers we have, one focused on public policy and the other on employer policies. And in those centers, we've laid out what we think are the most important research questions, and we're doing research on those now. There are a number of policies specifically targeted at people with disabilities, like home and community-based services and state-level employment first programs. Those employment first programs are the ones that really try to get away from sheltered employment that pays sub-minimum wages. So there's a number of interesting questions about policies specifically targeted at people with disabilities. But there's also a lot of concern about general policies that aren't targeted, but nonetheless may have differential effects on people with disabilities. Such as, one of the projects we're working on right now deals with employer paid leave mandates. A number of states, 12 of them, have require employers to provide paid leave. The federal government, as I'm sure many listeners know, has the Family and Medical Leave Act that requires unpaid leave, but these 12 states require some form of paid leave. In addition, there's minimum wage laws that we talked about. Another project is focused on unemployment insurance. These are general policies that may have differential effects on people with disabilities. And we're doing research on that now. I should mention a very preliminary finding is that employer paid leave mandates may increase employment of people with disabilities, draw a lot of people with disabilities into the workforce. A key issue, I think the biggest research question has to do with the changing structure of work, and that's very much tied to telework that we were talking about. How is this affecting people with disabilities? In particular, given that people with disabilities, as I mentioned, they're disproportionately in blue-collar and service jobs that cannot be done at home, most of which can't be done at home. Are there ways to somehow increase the flexibility of those jobs, meet the needs of workers, the blue-collar and service jobs, but also are there ways to increase opportunities of workers with disabilities to move to jobs that better meet their needs? We're going to see an occupational structure that's constantly in flux. Yes, we're still going to have blue-collar and service jobs in the future. The question is how to make sure that those jobs can be structured in ways that are good for people with and without disabilities, but also make sure that people have the opportunities to move to move to occupations and jobs that may work better for them.
That's plenty to think about. I'll ask you just one last question, kind of an open-ended question. Our listeners will be policymakers. They'll be certainly employers, human resource professionals. There'll be many segments of the disability community. Are you optimistic as a researcher who has been looking very closely at such a range of issues you've raised today and the challenges of increasing employment for people with disabilities? But are you optimistic about the future? Is it the possibilities in a positive way of technology? Is it changes to the workplace? But as a researcher, what's your sort of overarching feeling about where are we headed in terms of improving employment and economic advancement for people with disabilities?
By nature, I tend to be an optimistic person. I grew up in the Midwest, and maybe it just comes with the with something in the water or the air. So by nature, I tend to be an optimistic person. I have had times over the past couple of decades where I've been very discouraged, particularly in the late 90s when when the employment of people with disabilities seemed to be going down, and it turns out that was probably due to increased access to disability income. But at any rate, it was a very kind of sobering time, and there wasn't a lot of attention to disability from a policy perspective. Of course, there was the ADA, and there was some other legislation at that time, the Ticket to Work and Work Incentives Improvement Act in 1999. But I think over the past decade, we've seen a lot more attention to employment of people with disabilities. Disability was just a simple example here. Disability was not ever really mentioned in a presidential campaign until 2016. But then it became a big issue. There was a lot of mobilization of people with disabilities in 2016 and 2020, and politicians pay attention to that. That's all to say, I think there's a lot of good energy around improving employment of people with disabilities and improving inclusion in general of people with disabilities. Regarding technology, there is apart from policy, I think technological developments have great potential to help people with disabilities. There's so many ways, as I'm sure many listeners know, that assistive technologies can help people with disabilities in their activities of daily living, as well as in the workplace. One limit on that, getting back to a little more pessimistic view, is that people with disabilities tend to have less access to computer and internet technologies that do people without disabilities. There's a real digital gap there, and that's largely due to lower incomes. They often don't have the money to buy the latest computer, the latest smartphone, and so forth. I guess the bottom line there is technological development has a lot of potential to help people with disabilities. These new technologies can help immensely. But there is a concern about whether people with disabilities will be able to afford them. And that's something where certainly the government, federal and state governments can help quite a bit by helping with assistive technologies. So the bottom line there is I am hopeful, but there are reasons for concern as well.
Well, I think your words are carefully chosen. I love your sense of optimism and possibilities. And really today want to thank you for being a guest of our podcast series, Let's Get to Work, Reimagining Disability Inclusive Employment Policy. You've given our listeners much to think about, many new ways to explore this set of issues, and hopefully will lead to improved employment and financial health for people with disabilities across the country. So thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to continuing to learn about your research and its implications for policy and employer practices. Thank you so much.
Great. I'm very happy to be part of this, and I would be happy if any listeners have questions about our work. Be happy to have them get in touch.
Sounds good. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to Let's Get to Work, Reimagining Disability Inclusive Employment Policy, brought to you by the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.